The penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline was quiet, save for the soft clinking of ice against crystal, as Mason poured another bourbon. Across the room, his wife Reagan slept soundly, her phone vibrating silently on the marble nightstand, a fleeting flash of a hidden message she had sworn was in the past. It was the perfect picture of a successful modern marriage, yet the foundation was already quietly crumbling into dust. If the delicate, dangerous unraveling of perfect lives draws you in, stay with me as the truth comes to light. The rain slicked the towering glass windows of the Gold Coast penthouse, turning the vibrant grid of Chicago into a blurred weeping canvas of amber and silver. Inside the master bedroom, the only sound was the rhythmic, soft breathing of Reagan. She lay on her side, bathed in the pale moonlight that cut across the Italian silk sheets. Even in sleep, Reagan Scott possessed an effortless, curated elegance. Her dark hair fanned out perfectly against the pillows. Her features relaxed, wearing the innocent expression of a woman without a single care in the world. Mason White stood by the window, a heavy crystal tumbler of Macallan loosely gripped in his right hand. He was exhausted, having just returned from a brutal 72-hour acquisition negotiation in Silicon Valley. All he wanted was the quiet sanctuary of his marriage, a place to strip off the armor he wore in the corporate world. Then the marble nightstand vibrated. A short, sharp buzz. Mason didn't turn immediately. He took a slow sip of his scotch, feeling the familiar burns slide down his throat. The vibration came again. 2 pulses. Normally he would ignore it. Reagan ran a high-profile PR firm. Corporate crises did not respect time zones, but something in the rhythm of the buzz, insistent somehow too personal for 2 in the morning, pulled at his exhausted mind. He set his glass down on the edge of the mahogany dresser and walked quietly to her side of the expansive bed. The screen of her sleek phone was illuminated, casting a harsh artificial glow over a framed photograph of their wedding day in Lake Como. Mason glanced down, his eyes adjusting to the glare. It was a notification from an encrypted messaging app. The sender's name was simply the letter M. I can still taste the wine from your lips. Tell him you have a late client dinner tomorrow. The Drake Room 412. The words hung in the digital glow, sharp and violent, before the screen went black, plunging the corner of the room back into shadows. For a long minute, Mason didn't move. The silence of the penthouse suddenly felt immense, crushing the breath out of his lungs. He didn't gasp. He didn't throw the phone. He didn't shake awake the woman sleeping barely 2 feet away from him. Instead, a profound, chilling stillness settled deep into his bones. M. Michael Williams. Michael. It didn't take a genius to decipher the initial. Michael, the rival venture capitalist who always lingered a fraction of a second too long at their charity galas. Michael, whose confident, predatory smile always seemed directed just slightly past Mason and squarely at Reagan. Mason looked at his wife. The delicate curve of her neck, the faint, expensive scent of her Tom Ford perfume lingering in the conditioned air, it all suddenly felt like a perfectly constructed stage set. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of building an empire, sharing secrets, and mapping out a future together. All of it dismantled, rendered entirely meaningless by 20 words on a glowing screen. A lesser man would have woken her. A lesser man would have demanded tearful answers, shattered the expensive crystal vases, and let the neighbors hear the agonizing sound of a heartbreaking. But Mason White was not a man who operated on raw, destructive impulse. He built algorithms. He predicted market crashes before they happened. He dismantled failing corporations with surgical, emotionless precision. He reached out and gently picked up his tumbler of scotch. The ice clinked softly, a lonely sound in the dark room. He looked out at the sprawling, oblivious city below. Reagan thought she was smart. She thought she was playing a thrilling game without consequences, heavily shielded by the immense wealth and unquestionable status he provided her. Mason took another sip, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. He would not scream. He would not cry. He would simply turn off the funding for her perfect, deceitful life, one unseen valve at a time. The goodbye would be completely silent, and by the time she finally heard the door close, she wouldn't have a single cent left to her name. He walked back to the window, watching the rain wash the city clean, already calculating his first move. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns dripping with diamonds and the unspoken arrogance of Chicago's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the charity gala, illuminating the meticulously crafted facade of Mason and Reagan White. They stood near the entrance, the undisputed king and queen of the evening. Reagan's hand rested lightly on Mason's arm, her laughter like a perfectly tuned instrument chiming politely at a city alderman's dull anecdotes. To anyone else, it was a portrait of marital and corporate triumph. To Mason, the warmth of her manicured fingers through his wool sleeve felt like a localized burn. "You're incredibly quiet tonight, darling," Reagan murmured, leaning in close as the alderman drifted away toward the open bar. Her breath smelled faintly of expensive champagne. She reached up, adjusting his silk bow tie with an intimate familiarity that made his stomach twist into a tight, heavy knot. "Just calculating their return on investment for this event." Mason lied smoothly, his voice a low, steady hum. "In admiring my beautiful wife." Reagan smiled, a practiced, radiant thing that did not quite reach the cold, calculating depths of her dark eyes. Smooth recovery. Then the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. Mason felt the shift before he saw him. Michael Williams moved through the crowded room with the predatory grace of a shark navigating a brightly lit aquarium. He was impeccably dressed, his smile sharp and charming, as he stopped to shake hands and kiss cheeks. When Michael's gaze finally locked onto Reagan, the transaction of a look was so brief, so exquisitely subtle, that a blink would have missed it. But Mason didn't blink. He saw the microscopic softening of Reagan's posture, the slight parting of her glossed lips, the way her hand tightened infinitesimally on his forearm. It was a phantom touch exchanged right in front of him. A shared secret screaming in absolute silence. "Mason Reagan, a spectacular evening," Michael said, stepping smoothly into their orbit. He extended a hand toward Mason. "Congratulations on the recent Silicon Valley acquisition." "Ruthless, as always." Mason met Michael's eyes, taking the outstretched hand. The grip was firm, competitive, a silent sizing up. "Just doing what's necessary, Michael. Survival of the fittest." "Indeed," Michael replied, finally turning his full attention to Reagan. "You look stunning tonight, Mrs. White. The PR for this event is flawless. Your firm always outdoes itself." "Thank you, Michael. We aim for perfection," Reagan replied. Her voice was perfectly steady, but Mason noticed the faint treacherous flush creeping up the pale column of her neck, a physiological betrayal she couldn't control. Mason watched the invisible heavy thread pulling taut between them, sickened by the brazen arrogance of it all. They were playing him for a fool in the very center of his own kingdom. "Excuse me," Mason said calmly, reaching over to pat Reagan's hand before stepping away. "I need a quick word with Nicole. Can I get you another drink, darling?" "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she said, her attention already drifting back to the man standing across from her. Mason navigated the crowded floor, the jazz band, and the clinking of glasses fading into a dull white noise in his ears. He found Nicole Davis near a towering ice sculpture, nursing a single glass of sparkling water. Nicole was a corporate shark in a tailored Armani suit, her sharp intellect only matched by her ruthless loyalty to Mason. She had been his lead counsel for 8 years, architecting the legal fortress of his immense wealth. "You look like a man who just swallowed shattered glass," Nicole observed dryly as he approached her, sharp brown eyes analyzing his rigid posture. Mason stepped into her personal space, lowering his voice so the ambient noise would swallow his words entirely. "I need you to run a shadow audit on Reagan's PR firm." Nicole didn't flinch, but her grip on her crystal glass tightened. "A shadow audit on your wife's company? Mason, you funded that firm. The optics alone—" "Look past the optics, Nicole," Mason interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, turning cold and absolute. "Check the capital flows, vendor payments, any consulting fees overlapping with Williams Ventures. Track every single cent that bleeds out of our joint accounts into her firm." Nicole followed his gaze across the room, watching Reagan and Michael deep in conversation, their physical distance respectable, but their energy dangerously entwined. Understanding dawned in the lawyer's eyes, hardening them into polished obsidian. "I see," Nicole said quietly, her tone shifting from advisor to executioner. "How deep do you want me to dig?" "Down to the bedrock," Mason replied, staring at his wife as she offered Michael a brilliant, genuine smile. "I want to know exactly what I'm paying for." 72 floors above the sleeping streets of the Chicago Loop, Mason's executive office was wrapped in a suffocating silence broken only by the faint rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. It was 3 in the morning. The city below was a sprawling grid of sodium lights in deep shadows, completely indifferent to the autopsy of a marriage taking place behind the floor-to-ceiling glass. Nicole Davis sat across from Mason at the massive obsidian glass conference table. Between them lay three thick, unmarked manila folders. She hadn't offered him a drink. This was not a conversation to be softened by alcohol. It took my forensic accountant less than 48 hours to bypass the superficial ledgers. Nicole said, her voice a flat, clinical murmur. She wasn't particularly careful, Mason. Arrogance often breeds sloppiness. Mason reached out his hand steady and opened the first folder. Pages of bank statements, wire transfers, and complex corporate invoices stared back at him under the harsh modern glow of the overhead pendant light. "Walk me through it," he commanded quietly. "The capital injections you've been feeding into Reagan's PR firm over the past 2 years." Nicole began, tapping a manicured fingernail against a highlighted column of numbers. They weren't going toward expansion or new hires. They were being funneled through phantom vendor contracts, crisis management consultation, strategic synergy retreats, advanced media analytics, all exorbitant fees paid out to 3 separate LLCs. Mason traced the names of the shell companies with his eyes. And the beneficiary of these LLCs, a holding trust registered in Delaware, Nicole replied, her gaze unwavering. "Controlled entirely by Michael Williams. He's been using your wife's company as a laundry machine, Mason. Your capital is keeping his struggling venture tech portfolio afloat." A profound hollow ache settled into Mason's chest, cold and heavy as lead. He flipped to the next page. It wasn't just corporate theft. There were personal expenses cleverly buried under the guise of client entertainment. A $40,000 charge for a private villa rental in St. Bart's last December. During the week, Reagan told him she was in London handling a PR disaster for a British oil executive. A pair of platinum Cartier watches, private charter flights. He was funding his own deception. Every stolen weekend, every expensive dinner, every silk sheet they laid on Mason had paid for it all. The realization was a slow-acting venom, paralyzing his heart while simultaneously hyper-focusing his mind. The physical betrayal was a knife in the back. This calculated parasitic draining of his life's work was an absolute desecration of his existence. "She's bleeding you out, Mason," Nicole said softly, dropping on the clinical detachment for a fraction of a second. "It's not just an affair. It's a systemic theft. We can file the injunctions by dawn, freeze her firm's operating accounts, lock down the joint trusts, and serve her with the divorce papers over breakfast. And I have the drafted complaint ready." Mason closed the folder. The heavy, expensive paper made a dull thud against the glass table. He stared at the reflection of the city lights bouncing off the dark surface, his mind operating at a terrifying algorithmic speed. If he dropped the hammer now, it would be messy. Michael would hire his own fleet of attorneys. Reagan would play the victim to the Chicago social elite, and the millions they had already siphoned would likely vanish into offshore accounts before a judge could freeze them. To win, he couldn't just cut the cord. He had to make them hand the rope back to him. "No," Mason said, his voice stripped of all warmth. Nicole blinked, a rare flash of surprise crossing her sharp features. "Mason, you are hemorrhaging capital. If we don't—" "I said no, Nicole." He stood up, walking toward the window to look down at the abyss of the city. "Do not file the injunctions. Do not touch the joint accounts. Let the siphon run exactly as it is." "Why, right?" Mason turned back to her, his silhouette framed by the glowing skyline. His eyes were devoid of the man who had loved Reagan Scott. What remained was only the ruthless architect of corporate takeovers. "Because right now they think they are stealing from a blind man," Mason said softly. "I want to restructure my personal trust quietly, move the primary assets offshore, and then we are going to give Michael Williams an investment opportunity so brilliantly lucrative he won't be able to resist stealing more of my money to buy into it." The scent of seared scallops and a white wine reduction filled the spacious, open-concept kitchen of the penthouse. Reagan was standing by the expansive marble island, pouring a crisp Sancerre into 2 long-stemmed crystal glasses. She wore a simple, elegant silk slip dress, her bare feet padding softly against the heated mahogany floors. It was a perfect, quiet Tuesday evening, a domestic sanctuary seemingly far removed from the corporate battlegrounds they both navigated. Mason sat at the edge of the dining table, watching her over the rim of his water glass. The past 3 weeks had been an exhausting masterclass in compartmentalization, with Nicole Davis executing the complex legal maneuvers through encrypted channels and closed-door meetings. Mason had silently amputated the financial arteries connecting him to his wife. He had restructured his primary holdings, transferring the bulk of his liquid wealth into irrevocable offshore trusts scattered across the Caymans and Liechtenstein. The sprawling portfolio of real estate saved for the penthouse they currently occupied had been quietly moved under the umbrella of anonymous corporate entities. To Reagan and to the world, their joint accounts still looked healthy, steadily fed by his routine executive salary. But the deep well, the immense unmonitored reservoir of capital she and Michael Williams had been secretly draining was now permanently sealed off. Reagan walked over, handing him a glass of wine before gracefully sliding into the chair next to him. She leaned her head against his shoulder with a soft, contented sigh. "I needed this," she murmured, her fingers lightly tracing the cuff of his tailored dress shirt. "The firm has been an absolute nightmare this week. 2 major crisis management accounts threatened to walk. I barely had time to breathe." Mason inhaled the faint, familiar scent of her Tom Ford perfume, mixed with the citrus notes of the wine. A month ago, he would have kissed her temple, offered to review her contracts, and helped her strategize. Now he simply analyzed the structure of her lie. He knew exactly where she had been for 3 hours on Tuesday afternoon, a boutique hotel suite in River North paid for by a corporate card tied directly to one of Michael's shell companies. "You always handle the pressure brilliantly," Mason replied. His voice was smooth, warm, carrying the exact cadence of a supportive husband. He lifted his glass, lightly clinking it against hers. "To your resilience." Reagan smiled, her dark eyes softening as she took a sip. "I couldn't do it without you backing me up, Mason. You know that. You're my rock." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air, a beautiful invisible vapor. Mason felt a cold, clinical sense of awe at her performance. She was flawless. If he hadn't read the shadow audit, hadn't seen the encrypted text message illuminating the dark bedroom, he would still believe he was the undisputed center of her universe. "I will always give you exactly what you deserve, Reagan," he said quietly, picking up his silver fork to cut a piece of the scallop. He listened as she seamlessly transitioned into making polite, animated conversation about her upcoming PR campaigns. He nodded at all the right intervals, asked the right questions, and offered the perfect measured smiles. Underneath the heavy oak table, the burner phone in his pocket vibrated once. A secure, automated message from Nicole's office. "Transfers complete. The vault is sealed." Mason smiled, finally taking a proper sip of his wine. It tasted exceptionally crisp and cold against his tongue. The trap's foundation was set. He was sitting across from a woman who believed she held all the cards, completely unaware that she had just been locked out of the casino. Morning sunlight sliced sharply through the eastern windows of the penthouse, pooling on the dark hardwood floors. The espresso machine hissed softly in the background, a warm domestic sound that sharply contrasted with the cold calculation running through Mason's mind. He sat at the kitchen island, an encrypted tablet propped up against his coffee cup. On the screen was a meticulously forged prospectus for a company that did not exist, Aetherus Biomedical. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction, engineered over the weekend by Nicole and a discreet team of international fixers. Reagan walked into the kitchen, the scent of her expensive lavender body wash trailing behind her. She was wrapped in a plush white hotel-style robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, observing his intense focus. "You're working early," she noted, taking a slow sip. "Is Silicon Valley still giving you a headache?" Mason sighed, a perfectly calibrated sound of executive frustration. He reached up, rubbing the bridge of his nose before locking the tablet screen. But he made sure to do it a second too late. "Not Silicon Valley," Mason murmured, keeping his voice low, injecting a note of exhaustion. "It's a private equity play here in Chicago, a biotech startup called Aetherus. It's infuriating." Reagan's professional curiosity, always closely tethered to her ambition, was instantly piqued. She set her mug down. "Infuriating how you rarely get annoyed by acquisitions, Mason. You usually just buy them." "I can't buy this one," Mason replied, his tone laced with a carefully manufactured bitterness. "They developed an AI-driven synthetic plasma, completely off the radar. But I just got the backdoor confirmation at 2 a.m. that they quietly cleared Phase 3 FDA trials. A massive European pharma conglomerate is acquiring them next Tuesday. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the information settle in the quiet room. He watched the subtle shift in Reagan's posture, the sudden stillness of her hands. The stock is currently trading for pennies on the pink sheets, Mason continued shaking his head. The second the acquisition goes public on Tuesday morning, it's going to jump by at least 2,000%. It's a guaranteed windfall. So what is the problem? Reagan asked. Her voice was steady, but Mason could see the slight dilation of her pupils, the predatory flicker of greed waking up behind her dark eyes. SEC compliance, Mason said, his jaw tightening in feigned anger. My firm is acting as a shadow advisor for the European buyer. Because of my position, I'm under a strict federal blackout period. My accounts, your accounts, everything tied to my social security number is frozen from trading in that sector until next quarter. We are completely locked out. He tapped the dark screen of his tablet, his expression a mask of regret. There are tens of millions of dollars sitting on the table guaranteed, and I can't touch a single dime of it. The window closes on Friday before the pre-market lockdown. Reagan looked at the tablet, then back at him. Her face softened into an expression of perfect, empathetic, wifely support. She walked over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. That is frustrating, darling. But you always play by the rules. It's what makes you the best. It's just hard to watch an opportunity like that pass by, Mason whispered, patting her hand. He stood up, adjusting his tie, and grabbed his briefcase. As he walked toward the private elevator, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening in the kitchen. Before the elevator doors even slid shut, Reagan would be reaching for her phone. She would be typing a secure, encrypted message to Michael Williams, handing her lover the golden ticket that would drag them both straight into hell. The view from Michael Williams's corner office in the Willis Tower was a sweeping panorama of power, a sprawling grid of steel and glass that he believed he was destined to conquer. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, checking the glowing screen of his encrypted phone for the 5th time in the last hour. The message from Reagan was brief, desperate, and incredibly precise. Ethirus Biomedical, ticker AETH, European Pharma buyout Tuesday. He is locked out due to SEC compliance. It's a gold mine. We have until Friday. Michael smiled, a sharp, wolfish curving of his lips that reached his pale blue eyes. He walked over to his massive oak desk, tapping the surface of his primary monitor. The Bloomberg terminal flickered to life, bathing his face in a harsh neon green glow. He typed in the ticker symbol AETH. The stock was practically flatlining, a penny stock buried deep in the over-the-counter pink sheets. To any conventional analyst, it was garbage. But Michael was not a conventional analyst. He was an opportunist who thrived on the bleeding edge of insider information. And he knew Mason White. Mason was a conservative, ruthless machine who never dealt in rumors. If Mason was frustrated about being locked out of a trade, it was an absolute certainty. The sheer poetry of it intoxicated Michael. He was not just sleeping with the man's beautiful wife. He was about to use Mason's own carefully guarded corporate intel fueled by the capital. Reagan had quietly siphoned from his accounts to build a fortune Mason could never touch. It was the ultimate victory, a silent coup d'etat. He pressed a button on his intercom. David, get in here. A moment later, his junior partner stepped into the office holding an iPad. You need me, Michael. Liquidate the short-term tech holdings in the Cayman Trust. Michael ordered, his voice clipped and vibrating with suppressed adrenaline. All of it, and pull the reserve capital from the 3 consulting LLCs. David frowned, his fingers hovering over the screen. The LLCs, Michael, that's the operating cushion. If we drain those, we expose the firm's liquidity ratios. What's the play? Ethirus Biomedical, AETH. Michael stated, not looking away from the terminal. Route the funds through the Bahamian shell accounts. I want maximum exposure before market close on Friday. Buy everything you can get your hands on without triggering an automated SEC volume flag. A pink sheet biotech, David sounded genuinely alarmed. Michael, we haven't done any due diligence. There's no clinical data, no SEC filings on an acquisition. The due diligence is that I have a source inside the acquiring entity's shadow advisory board. Michael snapped, finally turning his sharp gaze onto his subordinate. It's a lock. By Tuesday morning, this stock jumps 2,000%. We will clear 30 million in a single trading session. Do it, David, now. David swallowed hard, nodding once before retreating from the office. Left alone, Michael leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. He watched the digital numbers on the terminal, visualizing the massive influx of capital about to flood the dead stock. He felt untouchable. He had outsmarted the great Mason White, using his own wife as the perfect, willing Trojan horse. He picked up his encrypted phone and typed a single reply to Reagan. Consider it done. I'll see you at the top. He hit send, completely oblivious to the fact that he hadn't just bought into a gold mine. He had just voluntarily locked himself and his entire stolen fortune inside a burning building. The corner office of Reagan's PR firm was a masterclass in modern minimalist design, white marble, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping view of the Chicago River. It was Thursday afternoon, precisely 4 days before the supposed Ethirus biomedical buyout. The air in the room was climate-controlled to a perfect 70 degrees, yet Reagan felt a sudden, inexplicable chill prickle the back of her neck. She sat rigidly in her ergonomic leather chair, staring at the glowing screen of her MacBook. Error 403, access denied, master token required. Reagan blinked, her manicured fingers hovering over the trackpad. She had simply been trying to log into the secondary joint wealth management portal to initiate a routine transfer, a standard $50,000 retainer fee destined for one of Michael's LLCs. It was a transaction she had executed seamlessly a dozen times over the past 2 years. Now the digital door was bolted shut. A faint flutter of unease stirred in her stomach. She opened a new tab, navigating to their shared calendar. Mason was scheduled to be in a closed-door board meeting all afternoon. However, earlier that morning, when she had casually called his executive assistant to confirm their dinner reservations, the assistant had mentioned Mason was out of the building attending to personal estate matters. Discrepancies. Mason White did not do discrepancies. His life, much like his business, was an immaculate, predictable algorithm. Reagan reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over Mason's contact name. If she called the bank, they would require Mason's verbal authorization to bypass a master token lock. If she called Mason to demand access, she would have to explain exactly why she needed $50,000 of liquid capital moved into a third-party consulting firm on a random Thursday. Her own deception effectively gagged her. She could not pull the thread without risking the unraveling of her entire secret life. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, she opted for a carefully crafted text message. Hi, darling. Tried to route the interior designer's deposit through the secondary Chase portal. Got an access there, sir? Is the bank doing a security update? She set the phone face down on the marble desk, watching the second hand on her Cartier watch sweep across the dial. The silence in the office felt suddenly oppressive. For the first time in her 10-year marriage, she realized how heavily her empire relied on the silent, unseen architecture of her husband's wealth. 3 minutes later, the screen illuminated. Fraud alert triggered on the primary node last night. Bank froze the secondary tiers for 48 hours to issue new encryption tokens. Use the black Amex for the designer. See you at dinner. Love you. Reagan exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. A fraud alert. It was a perfectly logical, entirely mundane explanation in the realm of high net worth banking. It made absolute sense. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes and massaging her temples. She was just being paranoid. The sheer magnitude of the Aetherus play was fraying her nerves. Michael had confirmed that morning that he had aggressively liquidated nearly all their hidden reserves, pouring millions into the dead pink sheet stock. They were exposed, vulnerable, entirely dependent on Mason's leaked intel coming to fruition on Tuesday. It's just stress, she told herself, dismissing the lingering shadow of doubt. Mason was exhausted from his Silicon Valley acquisitions. Of course, his schedule was slightly erratic. She picked up her phone and texted the designer to delay the invoice, her confidence slowly returning. By Tuesday morning, when the phantom European conglomerate supposedly bought out Ethirus, she and Michael would clear tens of millions. She wouldn't ever need to ask Mason for an access token again. She would be untouchable. Reagan turned to look out over the glittering river, completely unaware that the glass cage she stood in had already been locked from the outside. Tuesday morning arrived in Chicago with a heavy overcast sky that mirrored the slate-gray waters of Lake Michigan. In his corner office, Michael Williams stood perfectly still in front of his array of Bloomberg terminals. It was 9:28, 2 minutes until the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. He had loosened his custom silk tie. His palms, usually dry and steady, were coated in a thin layer of cold sweat. Every liquid asset he controlled, along with every stolen dollar Reagan had funneled out of Mason's empire, was heavily leveraged into a single obscure ticker symbol, AETH 930. The market opened. Michael stared at the screen, waiting for the explosive upward spike, the glorious green surge that would cement his victory. Nothing happened. The ticker remained frozen. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then a harsh flashing red banner slashed across the top of his newsfeed. SEC halts trading, Ethers Biomedical, AETH, pending investigation regarding fraudulent corporate filings and phantom press releases, no known buyer. Michael stopped breathing. The neon green glow of the terminal reflected in his widening, horrified eyes. He lunged across the desk, his fingers violently hammering the keyboard, desperately trying to access the Bahamian shell accounts, to execute an immediate sell-off. Transaction failed, asset freeze in effect, federal mandate. The silence in his office was shattered by the shrill ringing of his desk phone, then his cell phone, then David's voice raw with panic screaming through the intercom. Michael, the clearinghouses are issuing immediate margin calls. The stock is worthless. They're liquidating the collateral. We are 50 million in the red. 10 blocks away. Reagan sat in her pristine office, a lukewarm cup of coffee untouched on her desk. She was waiting for the encrypted text from Michael, the digital confirmation of their immense, untraceable wealth. Her phone vibrated, but it wasn't a text message. It was a direct call from Michael's personal number, a severe violation of their strict communication protocols. A sharp spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. She stood up, locked her office door, and answered, her voice a hushed, furious whisper. Are you insane? You know, we don't call during business. It's gone, Michael interrupted. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was hollow, stripped of all its arrogant velvet, reduced to a dry, terrifying rasp. What do you mean? Reagan demanded, her hand gripping the edge of her marble desk so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The acquisition. There is no acquisition. Reagan, he choked out the sound of a man drowning in a sterile room. The company doesn't exist. It was a phantom. The SEC halted trading at the bell. Every cent we put in the Cayman Trust, your LLCs, the leverage margins, it's all gone. The accounts are completely frozen. The floor beneath Reagan seemed to evaporate. The climate-controlled air in her office suddenly felt suffocating, pulling the oxygen straight from her lungs. She stared blindly at the sweeping view of the Chicago River, her mind violently rejecting the information. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mason had the intel. Mason said it was a lock. A heavy, deathly silence hung on the line. The realization bled through the phone, infecting them both simultaneously. The flawless algorithm, the perfectly timed schedule anomaly, the access denial on the Chase portal. It hadn't been a leak, it had been an execution. He knew, Michael whispered, the absolute horror of the truth finally crushing him. He knew everything, and you handed him the shovel to bury us both. The line went dead. Reagan stood alone in her quiet, beautiful office, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the cold marble floor. She was completely broke, entirely exposed, and terrifyingly trapped in a cage her husband had built, without making a single sound. The silence of the penthouse had always been a luxury, a costly buffer against the chaotic noise of Chicago. Tonight, to Reagan, it felt like a pressurized tomb. She stood in the foyer, her expensive trench coat damp from the evening rain, struggling to steady her erratic breathing. The reflection staring back at her from the gilded mirror was a ghost pale hollowed out, the meticulously applied makeup unable to hide the sheer terror vibrating beneath her skin. She walked into the living room. Mason was sitting in his usual leather armchair, bathed in the soft, warm light of a reading lamp. He held a leather-bound first edition, a glass of mineral was there resting on the side table. The picture of domestic tranquility. Reagan's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She forced her shoulders to drop, painting on a mask of profound exhaustion as she crossed the Persian rug and sank onto the sofa opposite him. Rough day, Mason asked, not looking up from his book immediately. His voice was smooth, a calm current beneath a terrifying storm raging in her mind. Catastrophic, Reagan breathed out, letting a genuine tremor bleed into her voice. She leaned forward, burying her face in her hands for a calculated moment before looking at him with wide pleading eyes. Mason, I am in serious trouble. The firm, we've hit a wall. Mason carefully marked his page and closed the book, setting it aside. He gave her his full, undivided attention. What happened? A cascading failure. Reagan lied the fabricated story, tasting like ash in her dry mouth. Two of our biggest legacy clients are pulling their retainers due to a massive internal data breach on our servers. The liability clauses are being triggered. If I don't secure an emergency capital injection to cover the settlement demands and stabilize the operating accounts by tomorrow morning, the firm goes into receivership. I'll lose everything. She waited for the familiar shift in his posture, the executive problem solver mode that had always swooped in to shield her from the consequences of the world. Instead, Mason simply looked at her. His gaze was incredibly steady, unnervingly calm. How much is the shortfall, Reagan? 12 million, she whispered the number, feeling absurdly small compared to the black hole she and Michael had actually dug, but it was enough to stave off the immediate margin calls and keep the federal auditors at bay for a few days. I need a bridging loan, Mason, just a transfer from the primary joint trust. I can pay it back by the third quarter. Mason sighed a heavy, sorrowful sound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. Reagan, I told you last week, he said softly, his tone laced with a perfectly manufactured, helpless regret. I am locked down. The SEC blackout period regarding the European pharma acquisition restricts all movement of my primary liquid assets. In the restructuring of the trusts, the capital is currently bound up in offshore escrow. I don't have access to $12 million in liquid cash. Not by tomorrow. The blood drained completely from Reagan's face. You can't bypass it. Mason, you are on the board. You know the banking executives. You can make a call. To bypass a federal SEC lock is wire fraud, darling. Mason replied, his eyes dark and unreadable. I would be risking federal prison and the immediate forfeiture of my entire portfolio. You know I cannot cross that line. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally cracked her pristine veneer. So that's it. You're just going to let my life's work burn to the ground. Her voice rose shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceiling. Mason, I am begging you. Mason stood up slowly. He walked over to the sofa and reached out his hand, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. Reagan flinched imperceptibly at the touch. I am so sorry, Reagan, Mason whispered, his voice an immaculate void of empathy. But sometimes a business simply has to face the consequences of its own toxic investments. There is absolutely nothing I can do to save you. He turned and walked toward the master bedroom, leaving her utterly alone in the crushing silence, slowly suffocating in the ashes of the empire she had burned with her own hands. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows was anemic and gray, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse. Reagan sat exactly where Mason had left her the night before. Her expensive trench coat was discarded in a heap on the floor, her makeup smeared like bruised shadows beneath her hollow eyes. She had not slept a single second. Her phone lay dead on the glass coffee table. Michael had stopped answering her frantic, weeping calls somewhere around 3 a.m. She heard the soft click of the master study door opening. Mason emerged fully dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, looking as crisp, rested, and impenetrable as he did on the day they first met. He carried a thick black leather portfolio under his arm. He didn't walk to the kitchen to pour coffee. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He walked methodically to the center of the room and dropped the heavy portfolio onto the glass table. It landed with a definitive hollow thud that made Reagan flinch. I believe you will need to retain independent legal counsel, Mason said. His voice was entirely devoid of the manufactured warmth he had worn for the past month. It was the voice he used in boardrooms right before dismantling a hostile corporation, cold surgical and absolute. Reagan looked up, her eyes bloodshot and confused. Mason, please. I can't do this today. I need to call the bank. The bank will not take your calls, Reagan, he interrupted, smoothly remaining standing, towering over her. Neither will Michael Williams. He is currently under federal investigation for securities fraud, and every asset tied to his holding companies has been seized by the SEC. Reagan stopped breathing. The name Michael Williams hung in the freezing air between them, dropping like an executioner's blade. "Open it," Mason commanded quietly. With violently trembling hands, Reagan reached forward and unclasped the leather flap. A stack of immaculate high-resolution photographs slid out onto the glass. There she was walking into the River North Hotel. There was Michael, his hand lingering on the small of her back at the charity gala. But it wasn't just photographs. Beneath them lay the shadow audit. Hundreds of pages of wire transfers, the phantom vendor contracts, the exact dates and amounts she had siphoned from their joint accounts into Michael's LLCs. And at the very bottom, resting heavily beneath the wreckage of her lies, lay the pristine legal documents. The divorce petition drafted and finalized by Nicole Davis. Reagan stared at the paper trail of her own demise, her mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the impossible. You knew. I knew, Mason confirmed, his eyes fixed on her pale, terrified face without a shred of pity. "I knew when he texted you at 2 in the morning. I knew when you smiled at him at the gala. I watched you transfer my capital to fund your stolen weekends, while you sat across from me at dinner and told me I was your rock." A choked, pathetic sob escaped her throat. "Mason, please. It was a mistake. I was leveraged. The Etherus stock." "There was no Etherus Biomedical," Mason said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft, intimate register. "There was no SEC blackout. There was no European pharma buyout. I created it, Reagan. I built the tape and I handed you the key, knowing exactly what your greed would compel you to do with it." Reagan recoiled as if physically struck, sinking deep into the sofa cushions. The sheer calculating cruelty of it finally broke through her, panic paralyzing her. He hadn't just caught her cheating, he had meticulously orchestrated her absolute financial and social execution, smiling at her the entire time. "You destroyed me," she whispered, hot tears finally spilling fast down her cheeks. "No," Mason corrected, adjusting his cuffs with practiced elegance. "I simply stopped protecting you from yourself. You and Michael destroyed each other." He turned and walked toward the private elevator, leaving the divorce papers resting like a tombstone on the glass table. The concrete walls of the Willis Tower subterranean parking garage amplified the harsh, erratic click of Reagan's heels. She had waited in the damp, exhaust-choked cold for 3 hours. The doors to her PR firm had been padlocked by creditors that morning. Her credit cards were declined. She was entirely exiled from her own life. When the VIP elevator finally chimed, Michael Williams emerged. He was flanked by 2 formidable, stern-faced defense attorneys. The golden boy arrogance that had once intoxicated her was entirely gone, stripped away to reveal a cornered, vicious animal. "Michael," Reagan stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar, her voice trembling. She looked nothing like the polished queen of Chicago PR. Her hair was damp from the freezing rain, her expensive trench coat rumpled and stained. Michael stopped. He didn't look at her with the lingering heat of their stolen nights, nor did he offer a shred of pity. He looked at her with pure, unfiltered revulsion. "Get away from me," he snapped, his voice echoing sharply, violently off the low ceiling. "Please," she choked out, taking a desperate step closer. Mason filed. "The accounts are frozen. I have nothing. The creditors are calling my parents. We have to figure this out." "There is no we, Reagan," Michael cut her off, his pale blue eyes flat and dead. "You fed me poisoned intel. Your husband set a federal trap, and you were his willing courier. My lawyers are drafting an affidavit right now stating that you manipulated me into that trade using your firm's fabricated PR data." Reagan froze, the chill of the garage seeping directly into her bones, paralyzing her heart. You're blaming me. I gave you everything. I funded your entire firm." "You were a liability," Michael sneered, pulling his cashmere overcoat tighter around himself, creating a physical barrier between them. "And now you are a toxic asset. Do not contact me again, or my counsel will file a restraining order." He didn't look back as he walked past her, sliding into the back of a waiting black SUV. The heavy doors slammed shut, severing their connection with absolute brutal finality. The tires squealed against the painted concrete, leaving Reagan standing entirely alone in the toxic fumes. Across town, in the immaculate sunlit conference room of her high-rise law firm, Nicole Davis sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. Across from her sat Reagan's hastily appointed, severely outmatched divorce attorney. Nicole slid a thick, flawlessly bound document across the reflective wood. "This is the final settlement," Nicole said, her voice a calm, lethal murmur. "My client is retaining 100% of the offshore trusts, the real estate portfolio, and all primary liquid assets as outlined in the prenuptial agreement regarding gross fiduciary misconduct." The opposing counsel swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "Ms. Davis, my client is left with massive insurmountable debts, are you from her corporate collapse, to leave her with absolutely zero spousal support." "Your client," Nicole interrupted smoothly, her dark eyes locking onto the trembling lawyer, "embezzled over $4 million from Mr. White to fund an illicit relationship in a fraudulent stock venture. The documentation, including the shadow audit and encrypted text logs, is attached in Appendix C." Nicole leaned back, resting her hands perfectly on the armrests of her leather chair. "If she contests a single syllable of this settlement, we will submit the audit to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. She will sign the papers by 5 o'clock today, or she will go to federal prison." There was no negotiation. There was only a quiet, absolute surrender. Nicole looked out the window at the glittering Chicago skyline, feeling a profound, clinical sense of closure. Mason's instructions had been carried out to the letter. The amputation was complete. The penthouse was reclaimed by a silence so absolute it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against the walls of the sprawling Gold Coast apartment. It was the kind of quiet Mason had once dreamed of, the peace of a man who had successfully eliminated every threat, secured every asset, and purged every lie from his perimeter. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the Chicago skyline as the first winter snow began to drift down soft and indifferent over the city. In his hand was a glass of the same Macallan he had poured on the night it all began. The bottle was nearly empty now. The divorce had been finalized an hour ago. Nicole had called with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon confirming a successful amputation. Reagan was gone, her name scrubbed from the building's registry, her designer clothes and curated life reduced to a few boxes currently sitting in a cheap storage unit in the suburbs. Michael Williams was facing a grand jury, his reputation shattered beyond repair, his assets frozen in the amber of a federal investigation. Mason had won. He was richer than he had been a month ago, his personal trust reinforced and his corporate legacy untarnished. He walked through the living room, his footsteps echoing on the polished mahogany. He stopped at the marble island where Reagan had poured wine just weeks before, whispering that he was her rock. He looked at the empty space where her handbag usually sat, the spot on the counter where she used to leave her keys. He felt no surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline. He felt only a vast, sterile emptiness. He had spent weeks operating as an architect of destruction, every smile a calculation, every touch a lie designed to counter her own. In his quest to punish her betrayal, he had systematically stripped away every remnant of his own humanity. He had become the very thing he despised, a master of deception, a ghost living in a house of glass. He entered the master bedroom. The bed was made with military precision, the silk sheets cold and unruffled. The scent of her perfume had finally faded, replaced by the neutral, scentless air of a high-end hotel suite. He sat on the edge of the bed, the crystal glass cold against his palm. He thought about the 10 years they had shared. He wondered now, with the clarity of a man standing in the ruins, how much of it had been real. Had there ever been a moment when they weren't just two predators circling each other in an expensive cage, or had the marriage always been a transaction, a merger that had simply reached its inevitable hostile conclusion? He realized then that revenge was not a healing process. It was a scorched earth policy. He had burned down the woman he loved to prove he couldn't be fooled, and in the process he had left himself with nothing to love in return. The millions in his accounts couldn't buy back the warmth of a genuine look or the peace of an honest life. Mason lifted his glass in a silent, solitary toast to the empty room. He had protected his empire. He had guarded his pride. He had won everything, and yet, as he looked out at the cold, beautiful city, he had never felt more like a man who had lost it all. The snow continued to fall white and silent, covering the tracks of everyone who had ever walked through his door until there was nothing left but the ice.